I'm going to ask you guys more questions than give you a speech. So right now, I mean, if this is an area you're interested in, this is an area that you clearly all thought about a great deal. What are the biggest hurdles for narrative in games in your opinion? You can either just shout it out or raise hands and have somebody there moderate. Up to you.
Could you repeat the question?
What's the biggest problem with narrative in games right now?
The biggest problem we're having in games. Shout it out. Do something, guys.
Yeah,
Biggest problem.
It's shout it out.
creativity.
Dig deeper. Tell me more.
Dig deeper.
Deep creativity.
Originality.
That's a synonym, honey.
Did you better synonyms?
Yeah, but it makes sense.
I don't-
Yeah.
Is it story?
This is excellent. No, but seriously.
Okay.
You're going to give me creativity. Expand on it. Why do you feel like there's a lack of creativity in games? What,
I feel
as
like
compared to other, why do you feel like that's the biggest hurdle for games?
I feel like it may seem that way based on like AAA titles because they do all of the sequels and
They don't like taking risks.
they don't like taking risks
They're
because
kind of generalized for the mass market.
right. I mean, there's a lot of criticism there,
Annualizing games.
but there's also a lot of areas where they're doing a lot of experimental things like in the indie scene. So I don't know necessarily.
That we are, it may not be creativity that we're looking for because really the same thing's true in most major media, right? You look at the films that come out every summer and, I mean, 3/4 of them are sequels or remakes. Most of them fit the exact same mold, right? You've got the same action film, you've got the same franchises and same set of IP that we exploit on an annual basis. So, let's say it's not creative. Let's say that there's plenty that we're doing with games. What else is there? What else is holding us back in terms of narrative in games? Because if this is a topic that you're engaged in, if this is something that you care about, clearly it's come up to you, right? Like, we wouldn't talk about narrative in literature in the same way, or much less narrative in TV. So what is it to you guys that made you want to do this topic?
I kind of picked the topic. I actually teach creative storytelling and character development. So I thought it was a good topic for people to know. I try to teach my students that there's a lack of, I think, strong character development in games. It's becoming kind of generic where people are doing the same type of characters over and over and over again. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine. I like to see new different kinds of characters.
So now we're getting into a little bit more specifics that we can talk about. But what is it? What is unique about games that makes character development so difficult for us?
Interactivity.
Tell me about interactivity. Why does interactivity make character development difficult?
In a traditional narrative, the character's development and plot is all, set in stone. But in a video game, you often have control over the main character and parts of this story.
The choices they make.
Mm-hmm. There's difficulty in pacing, especially, but also you can't force a player to go through all of these different roles and force them to feel things that the character is supposed to feel. That would come up with a bad.
So how do we create interactivity? How do we have to think about our characters in games as opposed to a traditional piece of media?
Kind of as extensions of the player, I think. Like, a lot of times, I feel like a lot of times the side characters will be more developed, like, and then your character will be something sometimes more generic because you're sort of relating yourself to it. So, I mean, I feel like there can be really strong characters, but a lot of times it's not the main character. So,
this is a good insight, right? You're absolutely correct. Very often, the main character is literally that, our avatar, our extension of self, right? And sometimes you go with a blank slate, but how do we make, what mindset do we have to get ourselves in as writers in order to make that character meaningful, right? Because the supporting cast, very often we can write in a more traditional way. But what do we have to think about? How do we have to view that character in order to successfully write for a main character in the game?
We have to think of it in terms of what the player might want to do in any given scenario.
What was that?
We have to think of it in terms of what the player might want to do in any given scenario.
Should we try
And-
to squeeze in maybe? Probably. Yeah, could we squeeze in just a little bit? Get closer.
Sit on the table.
Sit on the table.
Sit on
Yeah, you can sit on the table. Yeah, you can sit on the tables.
Sorry,
Yeah,
there's
sit on
no
the table.
teachers in here.
No teach. Well, Catherine's technically a teacher, but she doesn't teach
Yeah,
us.
not
There's
here
no
though.
on-duty teachers here.
It's all kids all the time. There we go.
Alright, has anyone here played Bioshock Infinite at this point?
No.
Yeah.
Most
No.
of it.
No, not everybody.
Then I will use that as my case example too much. Alright, so tell me the problems with allowing the player to make, how do I say this without just saying what I want you guys to come to discover?
You just say spoiler alert, we can close our ears.
So, what is it that, what are the problems with the range of player choice besides simply not being able to direct the narrative as much as you want? How do we, because really what I want to get to is there's a couple of things in terms of mindset that as a writer for games, you have to shift from most traditional non-interactive media. So what do we have to consider when presenting the player with a sort of blank slate character in order to make it meaningful? Or if you want to take it the other way and work from your own experience, what games have you played where you were playing that sort of blank slate main character, but you became very attached to that character? There's no wrong answers here, right? Like, the designer's credo is fail faster, right? The goal as a designer is to, you're never going to get it right. It's never going to spring fully formed from your head. And so this is a safe space, throw out any answer, and who cares? We'll build on it, right? It is better to be wrong quicker so we can get to the closest to correct answer faster.
I think Fable,
Yeah, now by saying words, somebody throws something at me.
I think Fable did well. You had a relatively blank slate character, and I mean, the amount of possible actions you were able to do while portraying whether you being good, bad, or whatever neutral. I thought that worked very well.
Interesting. Other examples.
I think Crackdown is also a pretty good example. As your character evolves, you can jump higher, run faster, that kind of thing. So you become more attached to like your vehicles as well. They change.
So basically anything that's
Yeah.
directly influential based on what you do in the game.
Skyrim.
So that's why games like Skyrim and
Skyrim.
Fable make such a good example, is because there's the good and evil or ethics example, but also there's the things that you do that affect the game.
Well, and also things like Prince and Katamari Damacy, like he's not very distinctive, but then you have like his parents talking to you, and like you have, I don't know, like you don't learn a lot about him, but you start to become like interested in that. I think I cut somebody off. Sorry.
I forgot what I was going to say.
All right, hand raising rule. Sorry, it's my fault.
All right.
I was
So,
gonna.
I remembered. Oh no.
oh wait, I heard something.
Yeah, I was gonna use. Someone mentioned Skyrim. I think Morrowind is a better example because you could actually
Oh,
kill
that's awesome.
key characters in the game, and it'll tell you like at the bottom like this character was like integral for the storyline, but you killed him. And it completely changes the dynamic of the game as opposed to Skyrim. You try to go up to whatever dude, you hit him in the head 70 times, and he's like, stop right there, criminal scum. So it's just you can't kill him, and even if you do, you come back later and he'll be there or whatever. It's just so I think Morrowind was a great example. It was very open ended, and even though it's not as immersive in the graphical or audio sense because it's a pretty old game. I think story wise, it kind of pulls you into the deep lore of the world.
Doesn't this kind of
No, go for it.
Doesn't this kind of depend on the aesthetic of the game that you're designing around? Because there are certain games where you kind of get into the character as a character itself, such as maybe a Star Fox, where you're playing it for the aesthetic of being a pilot, that kind of thing. But if you're going for something that's more oriented to the idea of the character or the players defining the character, you're going for a completely different design concept.
So this is the thing I kind of want to get to. There's a clear dichotomy in game characters. There are two types, right? There's the character-based for narrative, a narrative being the unfolding of a human drama, right? The character that you watch versus, and we've had main characters that are very much part of that drama where you do not have that range of choice. Building that character as a motive piece is very different than building the character for fantasy, for the thing that you want to live out, right? And when we do all this talking about choice, it's very often that fantasy-based. The key part to me to remember when building this sort of character that is more shapeable, right? Your blank slate, your avatar, which you're going to create and fall in love with, is that the goal is to allow the player to tell themselves their own narrative, right? You are telling yourself a story. You are part of the creation process, right? And as writers, as designers, we can't hold you tightly to that. We have to accept the fact that this world isn't ours, right? Once you ship it, it's not yours, it's the player's. In order to really create such characters and build these out successfully, you have to think about yourself and your narrative as a whole as laying out a space of possibility rather than simply laying out a linear map, right? So I always start with, what is the idea I want to explore? What are the questions that I want the player to be able to investigate for themselves and sort of answer for themselves, right? This can be emotional, emotive questions. This can be philosophical questions. This can be anything you want, but really have that space well defined for yourself when you begin your efforts, because starting to me with a story is almost universally disastrous for games, right? I see lots of people come in, especially new people who want to write for games, and they come in and they've got a script, right? And that's the end they want to create. And there's a whole bunch of production reasons that that's a nightmare. But on the writing side as well, it is generally very difficult because you are trying to force a direction in a space where the player wants a certain degree of freedom, right? Agents, interactivity, these are the things that games provide. We should rely on that space. So think of yourself not as writing a linear narrative, writing a script, but think of yourself as rather laying out a space of possibility for the player to write dramas for, a space of possibility for the player to explore certain questions or ideas. And that's, to me, really how you get interesting characters, because interesting characters in games, to me, usually emerge when characters are used as foils, as different viewpoints on the same set of core fundamental ideas that you are exploring, right? I always use the old, I mean, we were talking about moral systems earlier. First, you've all heard me rant, right? Like, if you have a binary moral system, if you have a moral system which has good on one side and evil on the other side, by definition, your writing will be two-dimensional. I have always preferred the system, and one of the great systems I saw was back in the late 90s, EverQuest had a system where everything had factions associated with it, right? And you had all these different groups in the game. And if you did one action, one group would see it one way, and another group would see it another way. If you killed a halfling, the halflings would be very upset. But the dark elves thought that was pretty awesome. And what this actually ended up being is ended up being a morality system endogenous to the game, right? Normally, very often in these binary moral choice games, you see morality which is exogenous, right? As a designer, I choose this answer to this problem is the right or good answer. This answer to this problem is the wrong or bad answer. And that's not how morality works in real life, right? It works where I may see an action one way, you may see an action the other way, And creating a game world which has that space allowed players to gravitate towards the groups that they agreed with and learn something about themselves through exploring this world and answering these questions. Right? So that is, to me, part one of the things that you have to consider when creating narrative, creating an interactive world. So part two is development behaviors. What is unique? Let's start with mostly AAA games. What are the problems with delivering narrative in a game format, given the ways that we usually traditionally think about delivering narrative?
If morality is something that is dependent on the people who are interpreting it, and you're trying to make a game that is in AAA that appeals to the highest number of people, you have to make a very washed down experience.
So that we can argue back and forth on that one, but let's get past morality and just the actual format of the game, right? Like there are certain things. Writing for a television series is different than writing for a film because you have 30 minutes and have to plan for commercial breaks, right? Let's actually talk about just the structure of game. What is it in the structure of game that you have to think about as a writer or narrative designer in order to craft narrative for a game that's different than you might for various other visual, auditory, textual media?
The player is the variable. You don't really know what the player is going to do at a given point of time, and you will just have to sort of influence the player instead of telling him where to go.
So, sure, there's lots of indirect direction that you need to do, but what else?
The player chooses how long the experience lasts.
Right, so here's one issue, right? We have, as a designer, you can actually design exit points to the game where you hope to get players to have the best narrative experience, but you're correct, right? One of the issues you have to realize is that the player is going to leave at any point in your game, and what else? Tell me about also play lane and play intervals.
So, like, a lot of times the story is told through, like, a cutscene. But, like, I guess, wasn't there an issue with one of the Final Fantasies, the more recent ones, that, like, it was just, like, a living cutscene? So just, yeah, it was, like, you'd play, and then you'd have a cutscene, and then you'd play, and you'd have a cutscene. So, telling the story like that, you have to balance how much time you're playing and acting in the world and how much time you're actually doing like something like that where you're giving direct narrative information. I feel like balancing
right,
that.
And what's the problem that you see inherently? 13 is an excellent example. The excellent example of how to do it wrong. So what's the problem that you see there?
Well, you kind of have to, I guess if you're writing like a movie, you're going to plan like parts where it's slower or parts where it's more actiony, and you're going to deal with the flow. I feel like in a game, you really can't, like you have to see the entire experience, and you have to make sure that you're not giving too much time to just straight cinematics, or that you're allowing enough time for them to stay interested in the actual game, so they don't feel like they're just hopping between stones, getting to a prescribed location. Or I guess, that could be the point too.
Like Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah, Metal Gear Solid 4 is the biggest.
It was a pretty good movie.
The problem.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Looking at Metal Gear, but let's talk about that structure again, right? There's something inherently wrong with the structure that you laid out. Tell me what it is, right? Because you're right. That is very often how we've approached dealing with narrative in games. But there's something that should be wrong there, that is wrong there, that should become clear in a moment's reflection. What's wrong with that structure?
Well, the problem with having so many cutscenes in a game is you're limiting the time players can actually play in the game because you're constructing a story with them. So after you actually get to a cutscene scene, you're going to another point in the story and you're progressing a lot faster than if the player was playing and figuring it out on their own. I know my brother picks up a game, has so many cutscenes in the game, and after the game's done, he never plays it again. So if you're cutting the story and basically in half when the player would actually start playing to when they would finish it.
It shouldn't be
So, What was that?
You shouldn't be telling the story through
Yeah,
cutscenes. You should
it
be
breaks the
telling
interaction.
Yeah, through the gameplay.
Well, I guess it's
Right.
fragmented because if it's like a movie, it's all 100% that. But you're fragmenting it, so you're ripping them away from the story and then reintroducing it, ripping them away.
Because if you're introducing more cutscenes,
Insane way to deliver a narrative, right? We imagine a movie where you got 5 minutes of narrative content, and then you just watched explosions and shooting for 30 minutes, and then you got 5 minutes of narrative content again to continue the story you saw 30 minutes ago, right? That's insane. The idea of looking at only the cinematic portions of games as the as the sole narrative delivery mechanism within games is one of the biggest problems holding back narrative in games, right? Because there's a couple of things. A, you chop up the player's experience completely, right? Like, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, there have been plenty of times in games where I had a cutscene, and then 2 hours later I had another cutscene, and I had no idea. I couldn't remember who was doing what or like why this information was relevant. And then on the flip side, how many, let's say given a cutscene heavy game like, let's take Final Fantasy 13. How many hours of cutscenes do you think were in Final Fantasy 13?
too many.
Or what? Just be a ballpark, right? How many, if you combine all the CG in there that was narrative-based CG, right? Not like summons or whatever, how many hours of cutscenes do you think there were?
10?
1.
10 minutes per hour. That's my
There's
estimate.
by the way. I think this is the ratio is what I was trying to get to you, to get you towards, right? Someone said there's too many cutscenes, and then someone else said there's 10 minutes of cutscene per hour, right? Imagine even in your most action-heavy TV show, you're getting way more time for raw dialogue and for narrative delivery than 10 minutes per hour. You're never going to be able to flesh out your characters in your 10 minutes per hour, right? So you have to think past this structure of cutscene and gameplay as two completely different things, and narrative only being deliverable in one of the two.
That gets me thinking about Uncharted. That gets me thinking about Uncharted 2 versus Uncharted 3, because like Uncharted 3, they went over a lot of the story and the cutscenes itself, as opposed to Uncharted 2, they had the big set pieces and stuff, and there was a lot of dialogue that you actually while you were taking control of the character. And I mean, I think I know for me at least that's one of the reasons why I think Uncharted 2 was so much better, is because you were actually a part of the story development and the dialogue with the different characters, as opposed to Uncharted 3 where it's like, shoot, and then cutscene.
Right, and so let's just throw out cutscene as a way to deliver narrative. Let's say I tell you, make me a game, you can't use cutscenes. How do you deliver narrative?
Alan Wake had an interesting way of doing it. They would have the character talking through what was going on and interacting with characters and getting backstory that way, but they also had manuscript pages that you would find that basically tell the story of what's going on in the game from a different perspective, and it was really interesting, I thought. I liked it.
But that game also had cutscenes.
Yeah, it did.
My question is, why are cutscenes so bad? That yes, they have problems and they've been used wrong, but if it's my rule with cutscenes is if it's something we can't do in the game, then it should be fine. But if I'm playing a shooting game and there's shooting going on in a cutscene, why can't I be doing that?
Well, cutscenes to me aren't bad, right? They're a tool in your tool belt, but we drastically overuse them. So I would say let's go through the hypothetical mental exercise of saying we have to make a game. Rule is we can't make any cutscenes. How do we deliver our narrative, right? And this way you can figure out, okay, cutscenes are a tool, but they're not my only tool. What are my other tools for delivering narrative in a game? How else do I have to, as a narrative designer, plan for conveying this sort of information?
Well,
So what I
you have your dialogue, but you also have the scenery to tell your story too. The landscape tells a lot about where these people come from and what's going on in the game versus just being explained in a cutscene to you.
Well, environmental narrative is huge, right? Like there's a moment in Fallout where you walk into the trailer and you see two skeletons and plates on the table, and part of the trailer burned out, right? You know instantly what happens, and it tells you so much about the world, and sort of emotionally sets you up to be in the right emotive state as a player to play the game and get the most out of it. Which is one of the big things you're trying to do as a narrative designer, is just establish the emotive state to allow the player to tell themselves their own story. But okay, so environmental narratives and what else we got?
NPCs talking to each other, reinforcing what's going on. A la Mass Effect 3. And
So
all the Mass
background
Effects.
chatter and voice stats, right?
Mhm.
One of the hardest things to write as a writer are voice stats. If you think about, most of you guys have played a StarCraft game, yes?
Yeah.
I'll take that as. So one of the hardest things to write are the unit acknowledgements, right? Like you click on a guy and he says a little thing, and you tell him to go move somewhere and he says something else, right? You get maybe 8, maybe 10 words, right? But those give so much flavor to those races. So much of what we understand about the difference between each of the races is based in those little snippets that never interrupt play, right? And yet tell us a great deal, give us a great feel for the world. Okay, so what else?
Character design.
Character design. Tell me about character design.
The way a character looks, the color of their skin, the markings on them, their eye color. I mean, everything can tell you about where a character comes from and how they act based on how they're dressing or what they mark their bodies with.
Right, this is absolutely true, right? I mean, we debate all the time about the meaning of the gender of characters within our games, right? And we view characters fundamentally differently, right or wrong, dependent on gender, dependent on race, dependent on all these things. We got a couple other hands up now. Keep giving it to me.
Okay, just talk, guys.
I remember the original Dead Space was pretty light on the cutscenes, and as an alternative, they used audio, like Catherine mentioned, and they also used, they would have the models, they would just walk around and interact in this 3D world with you and converse with you rather than taking you out and losing the control. You could still move around. They may separate you in some way. There's a great divide. There's a crater, something. But you really felt for the main character in Dead Space, or at least I did.
And Dead Space is an interesting case because, right, they were trying to do it completely UI free, and trying to not interject themselves into the game and the player's immersive world, right? But what else? We've got at least a couple other tools in our toolbox.
I think that narration is fine. Like Bastion is one of my favorite games, specifically just because of that narration while you play.
Right. And it doesn't, but what's really interesting is, tell me about the narration in Bastion.
It talks about it as you play, and it comes from different angles. Sometimes it's internal, and sometimes it's about external people.
And, right, but it's not divorced from the game itself at all, and nothing like the way that cutscenes often are, right? Your actions are being discussed relative to this world and inform you about the world itself. What else?
How characters interact with the player, because
Okay.
like just how an NPC approaches the player character, or how they talk, or just interact, can tell a whole lot about the player character and his relationship with the rest of the people.
What else?
Sound. Well, I mean, like the music, like that's going on, or like like it can set a mood or a tone for an area.
Like
What's going
Limbo.
on. Yeah.
Limbo did a good job with making a lot of sounds and
Audio effects in
yeah,
general.
making you feel the environment.
There's a game I played recently called.
Most of you guys have played the Slender game, right? Slender is the old, like, the student game, right? Like, its graphics are awful. Like, everything about it is terribly poorly done, except for the environment and the sound, right? And the sound design creates the entire environment and creates the entire mood. And people knew instantly what narrative they were walking into, and how they should experience it based solely on sound design. Whether or not there are crickets in the field that you're walking through at night changes entirely, right? So you need to be thinking about all these things as a designer. But we got at least a couple more. Let's see if we can get to it. Anybody else? Any other thoughts?
I think the tool is that the player itself actually.
Any of you guys play Dark Souls or Demon Souls?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh yes.
What was that? Sorry, just.
Oh, I was saying that the tools that the character has to play with themselves, such as Resident Evil, there's only so many type ribbons, there's only so many bullets in your gun. That tells the feeling of scarcity and danger that you have to deal with.
Uh-oh.
He
froze.
He's
No, he froze.
He died.
It's kind of creepy, actually.
Someone hit reset.
No one else is playing Dark
This was essentially the side poster. It was back.
Yeah,
There we go.
Here we go.
He kind of
Sorry,
froze
I
there.
just.
Put a shoe on your head if you're real.
Any other thoughts? Anything else?
What about the actual character development? Not just so much the morality, but the way a character, the main character actually interacts, or his feelings and emotions at the beginning of the story can tell a lot about where they are in this. That was awkward. Where what the world is actually going through. So I know, like, a lot of characters, if the world is really beaten down and they're going through a really hard time, the characters in the story will actually reflect that as far as the way they carry themselves, the way they actually do talk. If they have like a twang to their voice, that can tell a lot about the story as well, in my opinion.
Well, there's a game I played recently called Badlands, and it's one of the most interesting ones in the sense that it doesn't open up with like menus or anything. You just start playing the game, and you end up with this little black space, and you're just controlling this little character as it floats through this landscape. But as you go through it, everything looks kind of twisted, and you can tell like there's some kind of machines. But as you get further on, like at first it's like these green, vibrant, growing areas, but then as the machines get thicker, they start seeming to try to crush you and do things like that. And you notice things like the character, if it ends up drifting too far off the screen, it starts opening its eyes wider. You can tell it's scared, and you kind of get some of that impression. It never actually tells you a story per se, normally like the literal sense of a narration. It's all just what you're doing within this world is telling you what's happening, like what you end up doing in there, how things react to you.
Feedback.
Yeah.
What about pieces of in-game literature, such as audio recordings or journals?
So, a lot of this was chopped out because I was losing you guys a little bit.
Oh.
But from the ones I just heard, character.
Oh, there he goes again. Do you think it's us, or do you think it's...
It could be two-way.
And yes, is vital to any narrative, whether or not it's a film or. Oh, am I losing you guys again?
Yeah, we kind of missed that part.
Yeah, I lost you guys.
That keyboard.
Sorry, I lost a lot of you guys' comments as well, but here's the thing I heard, right? Character growth is essential to any narrative, right? I mean, whether it's a film or a novel, watching the characters grow and evolve is what tells us about who they are. But don't only think about it in terms of the traditional literary sense of character growth, right? How a character progresses, how a character grows, if there's the character that wears plate mail and beats things with a sword, we think about and understand fundamentally differently than the character that wears robes and heals in the back, right? That is characterization. What these characters do in the game is part of who they are, right? Eris's death would have been totally different if she was a frontline warrior with essentially nobly sacrificing in a fight, right? But so that's one of them. Couple others to throw at you guys. If you play that right, periodically you'll run through the landscape and you'll encounter a body, right? And the loot that's on that body will tell you everything that it did, right? You'll find a dead character with all sorts of thieves' gear on it, and then up another few minutes of play, you'll find a locked vault, right? And you'll know exactly why he was there, what he was trying to do, and you'll understand, you get a better sense of this as a living, vibrant world. Also, interstitial messages, right? Cutscenes are not awesome, but we do always have to have loading time. We are not past that yet. And did any of you guys play Spec Ops?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of the narrative in Spec Ops, or a lot of the contextualization of Spec Ops, was delivered in the interstitial messages, the loading messages, right? Getting back to something like Demon's Souls, right? They also delivered stuff during the loading space. What they would show you is items in the game. This is not only good to drive the player to want to keep playing to get these cool items, but it also is essential because the items have a bunch of lore text associated with them, right? Even the way that you name your items in your game tell you about the world, right? We've all gotten the sword of some famous person within the context of the game world in a game at some point, and that tells us more about, right, where you place that sword, tells us more about all these sort of things. So really think through every venue you have to those narratives should be delivered continuously through game streams, not in segmented chunks in just cutscenes. But the biggest one I want to talk about, the one I really wanted to eventually get us to, is this idea of delivering narrative through play. The actions you take themselves have meaning. So give me an example.
Half-Life 2 was played completely without cutscenes.
Every action you, like literally any game you can pick, you will play.
Say what?
There's a lot of lag, I think.
I just lost you again. What'd you say?
I was just going with.
Again. What was that?
I was just going with Half-Life 2. The entire game is told through its gameplay, essentially. Like there's like obviously the dialogue and everything, but like it never. The story is never told from a different perspective, but you as Gordon Freeman. You are Gordon Freeman, and you get to experience the entire game as him, essentially.
To return to Spec Ops. Sorry.
And a lot of that's told.
Oh,
You go for it.
to return to Spec Ops, an example of losing control, or as you're slowly realizing that, well, you may or may not have control over your actions in the game, stuff like that. Your allies will stop responding to your commands to, hit a target, those kind of things.
Right. There is. Dig deeper though. Tell me more. Give me an action in game, and then tell me its meaning.
In Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl, if you go up and try to talk to someone, pointing your gun at them, they'll respond negatively. Like, it's like, are you trying to threaten me with, this gun pointed at my face? So you can put something down, and, it kind of builds, helps build this world that, they're in a highly tense situation, where at any time, some rival faction can come in and attack everyone, or some, mutant, dogs can come up in a pack and attack, and the game only has like 2 cutscenes, one at the beginning, one at the very end, and everything else, that you do, whether looking at this guy real close with a binocular, he's like, what are you doing type of thing, or it's very detail oriented, and it helps create a believable world without actually taking away control from you ever.
And this is sort of what I wanted to go to, right? They thought about the meaning of some of these actions. Everybody here has probably at some point in a game raised a gun to their shoulder and shot another human. And yet, so rarely do we think about the narrative meaning of that action, right? And in the game we just described, clearly that walking around with an unholstered rifle is part of the narrative, right? They understand the meaning behind an action. And this is really what we have to most essentially understand as narrative designers. The action, 90% of the time you're playing a game is performing those core fundamental actions. And so if you don't think about what those actions mean, you will fail to be able to deliver a truly successful narrative, or a narrative that's as successful as it could be, right? Whereas if your narrative is about the questions raised by the very actions that create fundamental play, it will be much more engaging exploration. So can somebody give me an example, one side or the other, either of games that didn't consider their mechanics when creating their narrative, or games that did a very good job at integrating their narrative and mechanics?
For me, I think Walking Dead did a really good job with like the actions and what you did because like they took a bunch of plain everyday people that there's nothing special about any of these people. They're just your next door neighbors, and everything you did with them, whether you argued with them or saved them or gave them the daily rations, like I felt like that made the game. That was the reason why I played the game because it took these average people and I got a relationship with each one of them.
And it's funny because everybody mentions the moment where you have to choose who to give it to, right? It's an incredibly powerful moment that was very cheap to create. But give me an example that really your core mechanics are part of the narrative, right? The thing that you're doing 90% of the time in the game.
Dwarf Fortress?
What was that?
Dwarf Fortress?
So, Dwarf Fortress is to me like Minecraft in the sense that it's your set of Legos for you to build your own narrative, but more essentially, right? Like, where do you have to consider the meaning of the actions you're taking in a game? When do the actions of the game you're taking function either directly or indirectly as a metaphor to illuminate the narrative?
Shadow of the Colossus, and I say that because while you're fighting, you're in a traditional setup, you're fighting a lot of bosses, but the way that the game presents the end, whenever you kill a Colossus, like your character dies, and that's like a little off-putting. It's using a paradigm wherein you're, as a character, trying not to die, and using that to sort of create an atmosphere of like, oh, what is exactly going on here?
Well, and they really made you think, right? Like, that slaying these giant creatures in Shadow of the Colossus is not necessarily a moral action, right? But most games just wade through with your sword, kill everything, and that's what you're supposed to do, right? This forced you to reflect through the mechanics itself on the meaning of killing these creatures, right? And we see this time and again. We talked about Spec Ops, right? Spec Ops continuously asks this question, is about the question of what it means to carry a rifle and shoot other human beings over and over and over again. Did any of you guys play Thomas Was Alone? Thomas Was Alone is definitely worth playing. It does a fantastic job at really establishing a feeling of friendship, right? Making us understand and delivering a narrative about friendship in a way that almost no game I've ever played has, solely through the use of instant mechanics, right? Getting these tiny square blocks to interact with each other because they have to help each other out to sort of get out of the situation they're in. Did you guys check out, we did an episode on loneliness. Did you guys get to check out that game at all?
Yeah.
There's a game called Loneliness on Necessary Games that does a remarkably good job at delivering these sort of mechanics to metaphor. But another one, right? Silent Hill, the second Silent Hill. The combat mechanics are terrible. But why? Because it's disempowering, right? Because they understood that a horror game is not about shooting everything that moves, but rather surviving, right? And that you as a normal individual, if you're more powerful than these things, it's not horrible, right? It's only frightening when combat is truly a last resort, or a last resort, one which you are not good at. And that told us so much more about the character. And so, over and over again, we're looking for how to use these mechanics to tell us things about a story. On the flip side, place where we fed, right? And I think most of you use Bioshock Infinite said this. I won't spoil anything, but the short version is, it's something that I've most often heard called ludonarrative dissonance, right? Play narrative dissonance. Bioshock is a game where it's not that the violence is bad. The first violent moment in that game is incredibly impactful and probably the most violent moment in that entire game. But over the course of the game, you just shoot and shoot and shoot. and the violence becomes numb, right? The violence becomes almost ridiculous given the world they've created, the context that you're playing within. And so you have this disharmony, you have this disjunction between your play and your narrative. And your narrative is much weaker because your play forces you out of that immersive space. So really thinking about how your play reinforces your narrative and is part of your narrative is what you are looking to do as designers, and shaping your narrative around that play rather than copying generic play that you've seen in other games and slapping a narrative around, right? And that to me is really the thing that's holding games back more than anything else, this idea of lunar narrative distance, taking play and having the play itself marginalize the narrative that we're trying to talk about rather than reinforce it.
Red Dead.
So that's the point that I really wanted to talk about. What was that?
I was going to use Red Dead Redemption as an example of the player, dissonance, because you're in the Wild West, and at the beginning you only shoot like a few guys, but by the end, you look at your stats page,
right,
and you've killed like 1,500 people in Texas and Mexico, and it's like that's a lot of people back in the Wild West, and to me, while I did still enjoy the story at the very end, it did create that dissonance, and it kind of tore me away from the story a little bit because of that.
Right. And did anybody play the new Tomb Raider? It's interesting because, right, all their marketing, they were talking about how they were trying to make Tomb Raider a respectable franchise and deliver a serious, meaningful narrative, right? Do the Nolan Batman version of Tomb Raider, and yet it is just rife. The entire experience is destroyed by this lunar narrative business, right? In the cutscenes, you have a cutscene where she feels super bad about shooting an animal, right? And then they put a collectible system. They put a collection system around killing the animals on the island. So you go and you, in play, slaughter every animal you can find because it's the way you improve your gear, right? This is terrible, terrible thing. Or she's supposed to feel uncomfortable killing human beings, and then they gave her these unbelievable finishers, right? Like, there's one where you literally take a climbing pick and put it in somebody's neck and then take an AK and just shoot them from sternum to head, right? And this is supposed to be somebody who's a teenage girl stranded on an island, never having killed anything before in her life, right? This is what makes the entire experience fall apart. This is what makes it, it's not that the play itself is abstracted from everything else about the game is not good, or at least not enjoyable in some way, but it's the fact that the entire experience collapses because there is no connection. In fact, there is a damaging effect. They're antithetical to each other, the play and the narrative. And so what I really wanted to get to today was just going through all this, talking about what tools you have, and finally getting to the point of the idea that the best tool you have is play, right? And if you can understand the questions fundamentally raised by different forms of play, you will create a better game around it. Whether or not your audience actually even gets it, right? We talked about Katamari. Katamari is actually about capitalism and his views on the semi-destructive nature of capitalist society. I mean, that's like literally what he talks about it being about. Does that come across? Maybe not, right? But it gave him a vector to explore this. Games like, we've talked a bunch about Spec Ops, right? Spec Ops, substantially better for having, in terms of narrative, for having explored these things than much, much more expensive games like Medal of Honor or Call of Duty or Battlefield. And it's solely because they asked the question, what questions do our core mechanics raise, right? And then allow the player in that space to explore. So if I have any one piece of advice for you, it's as soon as you get your play, as soon as you understand what the player is going to be doing for most of their time within the game, use that space, use the ideas that generates, the questions that force us to ask, to inform your narrative and direct your narrative. But I want to make sure I give some time for you guys to ask me questions. So if there's anything you guys want to ask, we've probably about 15 minutes. So yeah, shoot.
I had a question I really wanted to ask. When I was a kid, there was a lot of educational games, so I was when I was a kid, I was in that zone where you had like Freddy Fish and Putt Putt, and you had Math Blasters and Math Munchers and Clue Finders and all of these really in-depth educational games that would be like hours upon hours of actual gameplay. And some of them didn't have like a curricular basis, so it wasn't actually just math, but something like Humongous Games would make things that would either spark interests in different areas, or it was just like really interesting ways to create a world. And I noticed that that isn't around as much anymore, or at least not to the same scale. So you don't really go to Walmart and see like a lot of those games out there anymore for kids specifically. And since we have, mobile devices and internet and stuff now, I was wondering, like, what is kind of your take on that kids/educational game space, and what should we be doing, now to adapt? Because I feel like that whole area is, like, to me it seems like in the 80s, 90s area, you'd see development at a larger scale, or, more emphasis put on it as opposed to now.
So, a couple of things. First, I'm actually going to be doing some crowdfunding in about 2, maybe 3 weeks to address this very issue, because I think it is a problem. The problem comes from the fact that everyone there didn't used to be 2 different industries, right? The entertainment games industry and the sort of educational games industry, the scientific games industry, didn't used to be 2 totally separate, different things. Today they are, right? We don't go to the same conventions, we don't talk to each other, people don't switch jobs between an educational games company and an entertainment games company. Entertainment people don't ever get grants, and the educational side almost never gets published by someone who can push with the marketing budget through traditional channels, right? Through traditional channels. This all happened with the collapse of Broderbund. Broderbund, most of the games you named were published, distributed, that sort of thing, by Broderbund and the people who either purchased them or they purchased.
And they were taken over by Learning Well, I think.
Yeah, there's a bunch of companies, but eventually that whole thing collapsed. Learning company and all that sort of thing. And after that, the split became very clear. Today we have an issue with, there's actually a lot of money being spent on grants and that sort of thing in this field, but very often it's being given to people who are not traditionally trained in making games. And so you get things like flashcards with 3D avatars, or just like unusable training simulations, and not the sort of thing that you're thinking of or looking fondly at, right? Yeah. No Carmen Sandiegos, no Oregon Trails. On the other hand, we are seeing a little bit of resurgence in it with sort of homemade games of this nature on the iPhone, iPad, the general mobile marketplace, right? Especially for much younger children. Actually, there's a lot of good programs aimed at like 2 to 4-year-olds. It's just that we've missed the center of the market entirely. And part of it was just the fact that it's finally a place where the cost of developing a game has fallen to the point where people are willing to take risks with it, right? But it's a very good question, and I think that interactivity is an essential part of education. I mean, when I teach, just like with you guys, right? Like, I think you learn a lot more if you come to the answer than if I tell you it, right? And that's the power that games have. Games solve a lot of the problems that modern education fails at, right? One of the problems is You turn in a piece of homework, and 2 weeks later you get it back and you get a mark on it. And it's either right or it's not, right? And it trains you that you absolutely have to get it right the first time. And that's not how our world works, right? It makes children afraid of failure rather than interested in learning from it, right? Whereas a game, you play a game, you try a jump in Mario, you die, you immediately respawn, try that jump again in a different way until you figure out the solution, and then every time in the future you have that solution, right? And that's a much more productive educational methodology. I could go on for a long time about the value of games in education. I think it's slowly coming back. I think there's a lot of people pushing towards it. I will be pushing towards it myself over the next few weeks. But you're right. Right now, that market, there's a very tragic hole in that market.
Yeah, and that's
To extend off that question, what do you think are the positive and negatives of specifically the Khan Academy as a test case?
So my positive Khan Academy is more ways to self-educate are always awesome, right? The negatives are gamification in terms of simply adding point systems to things, to me is the incorrect way to approach things. I like Khan Academy. I have unfortunately heard too many people talk about effectively using systems like Khan Academy to replace or reduce the number of teachers we need, which I do not think is the effective use of Khan Academy. And I don't think I've worked for plenty of companies that have very, very clear research that show that when we add a point system to something, when we gamify in the traditional sense, we are very capable of getting someone to perform an action, compelling them to do their math problems over and over and over again, but not necessarily able to compel them to get anything from it, right? And so you talk to Farmville players and World of Warcraft players, and very often you'll find that they continue to play the game, and yet if you ask them whether or not they're actually having fun, they'll say no, right? This is not what we want. This is not the route we want to go. True gamification is about making things more engaging, right? Weight Watchers forever has had a point system for losing weight. Not super effective. Whereas on the other hand, if you don't want to get on the treadmill, if you're not inherently engaged by those activities, it's just not very useful for you. But on the other hand, I know plenty of people who have lost a ton of weight through DDR because, yeah, they wanted to lose weight, but they wanted to play DDR, right? And it had that ancillary effect. And so the activity itself has to be inherently engaging. So what we need to do is figure out how to either make things like math inherently engaging or find out what's inherently engaging about math, right? Like, we as human beings cared about it enough to devote huge amounts of time to the study of it, to the development of it. And there are things inherently engaging about it that are exciting and fun. And we need to pursue that rather than just put point systems around things. Other questions? I think I see one in the back.
I don't actually have a question. I just wanted to add to that. The mechanic of Doodle God, I believe, is a very good example of that. It's kind of funny and silly, but the idea of experimentation and putting two things together to see what happens is a very good example.
I probably have time for like 2, maybe 3 more questions. Anybody else?
Anyone got any questions? I got a question. Several developers lately have been talking about games needing to be more than just games. Like, for example, Warren Spector. He recently flipped out about the new Wolfenstein game, saying that, it's just another shooter. We don't need more gritty, dark stuff, things like that. Do you have an opinion on this? What's your take?
Well, I find I have a fundamental problem with the idea of more than just games, right? Because I think we've pigeonholed the medium. I think that saying that games need to be allowed to be more than just a pastime is absolutely correct, right? I think there's so much more that we can do with games, but I think that we are mistaken in saying, unless we want to rebrand everything in the same way that graphic novels rebranded comic books, I think we are mistaken in just saying, in marginalizing games ourselves. because there's always a space for our junk food 3D blockbuster, right? This is all summer films. But we don't say that films are not valuable as a medium. We don't think of films as just that, right? And I would like to think of games the same way. Sure, there will always be Call of Duties. That's awesome. That's great, right? They're fun. They're actually play. Sometimes you just want to like zone out and play some Call of Duty. But we do need to be able to express more. And I think that we're taking great strides towards that. And curtailing that anyway is immensely damaging for the medium. I hope that answered your question.
Okay. Anyone else got a question?
No one else.
Go ahead.
Do you have any opinion as to why rail shooters are not popular anymore?
Well, rail shooters, rail shooters are a production thing, right? They were cheap to make, and especially in the early days of 3D, there's a lot that you can do on the production side to reduce the cost while making the rail shooter look better because you know where the player's looking. And we don't need to do that today. This means that tragically it's unlikely we'll get another Pokemon Snap, which may be the greatest rail shooter of all time. But I would say that rail shooters is just production thing, right? We now have the technology, so we don't have to do rail shooters anymore, so we've abandoned them. This may be a mistake, but that's what happened.
Anyone else?
I have time for one more. I thought I saw one more hand, and
What do you
if there's anyone else who has a burn question.
What do you think about incorporating an in-depth story into something like an arcade game, like a Galaga type setting? Like, is that even possible? How would you go about exploring integrating the story with the gameplay elements in that case?
Like everything else, you have to, like we talked about with television, right? The medium you're delivering things in is, you have to think about it while you're building out your narrative, right? And so, delivering a narrative in an arcade type experience, I think is very distinctly possible, but it's a very different narrative than the sort of narrative that you get out of a traditional game, right? And part of how you monetize in arcade experiences is through short play length, right? Because you're paying per level. So you're going to have to think about how do you encapsulate that narrative in a 3 to 5 minute experience, right? How do we deliver it when we don't know how far everybody is going? What I would do probably is set up a world and make the narrative, make death a actually integral part of the narrative, right? Because this is another mechanic that we never think about, right? Like, Sonic dies, what happens to Sonic when he dies, right? Like, we don't think about it in terms of part of the narrative. But here in arcade, right, death is very, very clearly part of the mechanics and something that you're forced to think about when you have to put in another coin. And so if I made every single coin, if I gave every character their own unique name and basically had some procedurally generated but tightly constrained story that was about their little adventure and their life, and we could get you invested in wanting to keep this one unique individual who would never be back again alive as long as possible, that's the sort of narrative you can deliver. But if you're going to do something in that sort of venue, you just have to think about the venue itself. But I've unfortunately got to run. I have meetings to get to, and it was great chatting with all of you guys. Thanks for having me out.
Thank you. Awesome. What? Yay.
Good topic.